Who's ready to learn about critical race theory? I'll be reading Toward a Critical Race Theory of Education by Gloria, Ladson-Billings, and William F. Tate IV of the University of Wisconsin. Let us begin. This article asserts that despite the salience of race in U.S. society as a topic of scholarly inquiry, it remains untheorized. The article argues for a critical race theoretical perspective in education analogous to that of critical race theory in legal scholarship by developing three propositions. 1. Race continues to be significant in the United States. 2. The U.S. society is based on property rights rather than human rights. And 3. The intersection of race and property creates an analytical tool for understanding inequity. The article concludes with a look at the limitations of the current multicultural paradigm. Then there's a quote from Frederick Douglass. In 1991, social activist and educational critic Jonathan Gozel delineated the great inequities that exist between the schooling experiences of white middle-class students and those of poor African American and Latino students. And while Gozel's graphic descriptions may prompt some to question how it is possible that we allow these savage inequalities, this article suggests that these inequalities are a logical and predictable result of the racialized society in which discussions of race and racism continue to be muted and marginalized. In this article, we attempt to theorize race and use it as an analytical tool for understanding school inequity. Wait a minute. That means they're just going to blame every inequality of outcome in school on race. Oh no. Anyways, we begin with a set of propositions about race and property and their intersections. We situate our discussion in an explication of critical race theory and an attempt to move beyond the boundaries of the educational research literature to include arguments and new perspectives from law and the social sciences. So they're just going to be using critical race theory of law, but on education. In doing so, we acknowledge and are indebted to a number of scholars whose work crosses disciplinary boundaries. We conclude by exploring the tensions between our conceptualization of a critical race theory in education and the educational reform movement identified as multicultural education. So that's not great. Well, I can tell you one thing for sure. It gets worse. And I promise, it ain't gonna stop getting worse till we're done. And I want to remind y'all real quick. They just sort of assert these three things, and they don't actually support them later on in the article. Those are just sort of assumed to be immutable facts of the universe. Part 2. Understanding race and property. Our discussion of social inequity in general and school inequity in particular is based on three central propositions that they propose and don't really prove. But anyways, 1. Race continues to be a significant factor in determining inequity in the United States. 2. U.S. society is based on property rights. And 3. The intersection of race and property creates an analytic tool through which we can understand social and consequently school inequity. In this section, we expand on these propositions and provide supporting meta-positions to make clear our line of reasoning and relevant application to educational and school settings. I sure hope they actually do. So just from this, we already have a pretty good idea about foundationally what critical race theory is in the belief of these three assertions. And spoilers, they don't actually substantiate any of these. They just sort of assert them and then move on. Part 3. Race as factor in inequity. The first proposition, that race continues to be a significant factor in determining inequity in the United States, is easily documented in the statistical and demographic data. But they were comparing middle-class whites to poor students of color. Anyways, hackers look at educational and life chances, such as high school dropout rates, suspension rates, and incarceration rates, echoes earlier statistics of the Children's Defense Fund. However, in what we now call the postmodern era, some scholars question the usefulness of race as a category. Omi and Winage argue that popular notions of race as either an ideological construct or an objective condition have epistemological limitations. Thinking of race strictly as an ideological concept denies the reality of a racialized society and its impact on raced people in their everyday lives. On the other hand, thinking of race solely as an objective condition denies the problematic aspects of race. How do we decide who fits into which racial classification? How do we categorize racial mixtures? Indeed, the world of biology has found the concept of race virtually useless. Geneticist Cavalli Forza asserts that human populations are sometimes known as ethnic groups or races. They're hard to define in a way that is both rigorous and useful because human beings group themselves in bewildering array of sets, some of them overlapping all of them in a state of flux. Nonetheless, even when the concept of race fails to make sense, we continue to employ it. So it's more complicated and nuanced than the oversimplification that you're striving for. Therefore, you want to make a new, overly complicated, unnuanced recategorization process? That's what I heard. Yeah, anyways, according to Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, race has become metaphorical, a way of referring to and discussing forces, events, classes, and expressions of social decay and economic division far more threatening to the body politic than biological race ever was. Expensively kept, economically unsound, a spurious and useless political asset in election campaigns, racism is as healthy today as it was during the Enlightenment. It seems that it has utility far beyond economy, beyond the sequestering of classes from one another, and has assumed a metaphorical life so completely embedded in daily discourse that it is perhaps more necessary and more on display than ever before. Despite the problematic nature of race, we offer as a first metaposition that race, unlike gender and class, remains untheorized. Over the past few decades, theoretical and epistemological considerations of gender have proliferated. Though the field continues to struggle for legitimacy in academia, interest in and publications about feminist theories abound. At the same time, Marxist and neo-Marxist formulations about class continue to merit consideration as theoretical models for understanding social inequity. Wait a minute. That's what they're referring to as theories and theorizing. Marxist and neo-Marxist formulations about class, but about race. That's what they're fucking talking about. Not a theory of gravity or evolution, but a Marxist theory of race in education. Let's continue. We recognize the importance of both gender and class-based analysis, while at the same time pointing to their shortcomings vis-a-vis race. Roediger points out that the main body of writing by white Marxists in the United States has both naturalized whiteness and oversimplified race. Omi and Winnett have done significant work in providing a sociological explanation of race in the United States. They argue that the paradigms of race have been conflated with notions of ethnicity, class, and nation because theories of race, of its meaning, its transformations, and the significance of racial events have never been a top priority in social science. In the US, although the founding fathers of American sociology were explicitly concerned with the state of domestic race relations, racial theory remained one of the least developed fields of sociological inquiry. To mount a viable challenge to the dominant paradigm of ethnicity, i.e., we are all ethnic, and consequently must assimilate and rise socially the same way European Americans have, Omi and Winnett offer a race formation theory that they define as the socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. It is a process of historically situated projects in which human bodies and social structures are represented and organized. Further, they link racial formation to the evolution of hegemony, the way in which society is organized and ruled. Their analysis suggests that race is a matter of both social structure and cultural representation. By arguing that race remains untheorized, we're not suggesting that other scholars have not looked carefully at race as a powerful tool for explaining social inequity, but that the intellectual salience of this theorizing has not been systematically employed in the analysis of educational inequality. It's not that they were looking for the answer that we wanted, it's that they just didn't look hard enough. Thus, like Omi and Winnett, we are attempting to uncover or decipher the social, structural, and cultural significance of race in education. We've already decided that it's a significant factor, we just need to find the evidence. Our work owes an intellectual debt to both Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois, who, although marginalized by the mainstream academic community, used race as a theoretical lens for assessing social inequity. Both Woodson and Du Bois presented cogent arguments for considering race as the central construct for understanding inequality. In many ways, our work is an attempt to build on the foundation laid by these scholars. Briefly, Woodson, as far back as 1916, began to establish the legitimacy of race, and in particular, African Americans, as a subject of scholarly inquiry. As founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and editor of its Journal of Negro History, Woodson revolutionized the thinking about African Americans from that of pathology and inferiority to a multi-textural analysis of the uniqueness of African Americans and their situation in the United States. His most notable publication, The Miseducation of the Negro, identifies the school role in structuring inequality and demotivating African American students. The same educational process which inspires and stimulates the oppressor with the thought that he is everything it has accomplished, everything worthwhile, depresses and crushes at the same time the spark of genius in the Negro by making him feel that his race does not amount to much and never will measure up to the standards of other people. Good God, they really just sort of kept hold of all the awful racialist positions of the 1800s. Du Bois, perhaps better known among mainstream scholars, profoundly impacted the thinking of many identified as other by naming a double consciousness felt by African Americans. According to Du Bois, the African American ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings. In a current biography of Du Bois, Lewis details the intellectual impact of this concept. It was a revolutionary concept. It was not just revolutionary, the concept of the divided self was profoundly mystical. For Du Bois invested this double consciousness with a capacity to see incomparably further and deeper. The African American, seventh son after the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, possessed the gift of second sight in this American world, an intuitive faculty, pre-logical in a sense, enabling her to see and say things about American society that possessed a heightened moral validity. Because he dwelt equally in the mind and heart of his oppressor as in his own psyche, the African American embraced a vision of the commonweal at its best. I don't know that I really have to explain that one, Jesus Christ! So as we can see, CRT is literally just Marxism, but race instead of class, with some really gross 19th century mysticism thrown in. And remember, this is like a big deal work. Those are the writers. Part 4, a continuation. As a prophetic foreshadowing of the centrality of race in U.S. society, Du Bois reminded us that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The second meta-proposition that we use to support the proposition that race continues to be significant in explaining inequity in the United States is that class and gender-based explanations are not powerful enough to explain all of the difference or variance in school experience and performance. Because since their explanation isn't good enough, it lends more credence to our explanation. Because two things can't be wrong. Although both class and gender can and do intersect race, as standalone variables, they do not explain all of the educational achievement differences apparent between whites and students of color. Indeed, there is some evidence to suggest that even when we hold constant for class, middle-class African American students do not achieve at the same level as their white counterparts. Although Oakes reports that in academic tracking, poor and minority students are most likely to be placed in the lowest levels of the school sorting system, we're less clear as to which factor, race or class, is causal. Perhaps the larger question of the impact of race on social class is the more relevant one. We don't really know, but you should trust us anyways. Space limitations do not permit us to examine that question. So just don't think about it. Issues of gender bias also figure in inequitable schooling. Females receive less attention from teachers, are counseled away from or out of advanced mathematics and science courses, and although they receive better grades than their male counterparts, their grades do not translate into advantages in college admissions and or the workplace. But examination of class and gender taken alone or together do not account for the extraordinarily high rate of school dropouts, suspensions, expulsions, and failure among African American and Latino males. In the case of suspension, Majors and Bilson argue that many African American males are suspended or expelled from school for what they termed non-contact violations, wearing banned items of clothing such as hats and jackets, or wearing these items in an unauthorized manner, such as backwards or inside out. The point we strive to make with this meta-proposition is not that class and gender are insignificant, but rather, as West suggests, that race matters, and as Smith insists, blackness matters in more detailed ways. So it's literally to purposefully blame race, and their conclusion after that is to hyper-focus on race because they've already decided that race is the cause of the inequity. Therefore, you can't ignore race because it's the cause, because they decided that it's the cause. And don't just take my word for it. This is critical race theory in education. Part 5. The property issue. Our second proposition, that U.S. society is based on property rights, is best explicated, that's not explained, but analyzed and thought about, by examining legal scholarship and interpretations of rights. To develop this proposition, it is important to situate it in the context of critical race theory. To better think about it, you have to look at it through the lens we decided to look through. Monaghan reports that critical race legal scholarship developed in the 1970s in part because minority scholars thought they were being overlooked in critical legal studies, a better-known movement that examines the way law encodes cultural norms. So that's the old CRT, it's just law instead of education, so that's already been a thing. However, Delgado argues that despite the diversity contained within the critical race movement, there are some shared features. An assumption that racism is not a series of isolated acts, but is endemic in American life, deeply ingrained legally, culturally, and even psychologically. A call for reinterpretation of civil rights law in light of its ineffectuality, showing that laws to remedy racial injustices are often undermined before they can fulfill their promise. See, it's not that they don't work, it's that they're being undermined and sabotaged. A challenge to the traditional claim of legal neutrality, objectivity, color-blindness, and meritocracy as camouflages for the self-interest of dominant groups in American society. And remember, it's not that they're not being objective, it's that society is just built to benefit the dominant groups. An instance of subjectivity and the reformulation of legal doctrine to reflect the perspectives of those who have experienced and been victimized by racism firsthand. The use of stories of first-person accounts, anecdotes. That's what they want to base civil rights laws on, is anecdotes. Onward! In our analysis, we add another aspect to this critical paradigm that disentangles democracy and capitalism. Many discussions of democracy conflate it with capitalism, despite the fact that it is possible to have a democratic government with an economic system other than capitalism. Discussing the two ideologies as if they were one masks the pernicious effects of capitalism on those who are relegated to its lowest ranks. Traditional civil rights approaches to solving inequality have depended on the rightness of democracy while ignoring the structural inequality of capitalism. They believe capitalism is a caste system. However, democracy in the US context was built on capitalism. In the early years of the Republic, only capitalists enjoyed the franchise. 200 years later, when civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 60s built their pleas for social justice on an appeal of the civil and human rights, they were ignoring the fact that society was based on property rights. An example from the 1600s underscores the centrality of property in the Americas from the beginning of European settlement. When the Pilgrims came to New England, they too were coming not to vacant land, but to territory inhabited by tribes of Indians. The governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, created the excuse to take Indian land by declaring the area legally a vacuum. The Indians, he said, had not subdued the land and therefore had only a natural right to it, but not a civil right. A natural right did not have legal standing. Nobody tell him about the Romans dealing with Germanic tribes. Bell examined the events leading up to the Constitution's development and concluded that there exists a tension between property rights and human rights. This tension was greatly exacerbated by the presence of African peoples as slaves in America. The purpose of the government was to protect the main object of society, property. The slave status of most African Americans, as well as women and children, resulted in their being objectified as property, and a government constructed to protect the rights of property owners lacked the incentive to secure human rights for the African American. According to Bell, the concept of individual rights unconnected to property rights was totally foreign to these men of property, and thus, despite 2 decades of civil rights gains, most blacks remain disadvantaged and deprived because of their race. So it was definitely built to protect property rights, because not everyone had protected human rights. Therefore, it was only about property rights. And therefore, since it's built to only protect property rights, it can't be fixed to protect human rights. The grand narrative of U.S. history is replete with tensions and struggles for property in its various forms. Except Rule fucking 1, but okay. From the removal of Indians and later Japanese Americans from the land to military conquest of the Mexicans to the construction of Africans as property, the ability to define, possess, and own property has been a central feature of power in America. Therefore, it is only built on property rights. We do not suggest that other nations have not fought over and defined themselves by property and land ownership. However, the contradiction of a reified, symbolic individual juxtaposed to the reality of real estate means that the emphasis on the centrality of property can be disguised. Thus, we talk about the importance of the individual rights, and civil rights while social benefits accrue largely to property owners. So because people tend to benefit from owning property, focusing on civil rights points even more to the conclusion that the U.S. is founded on property rights than it would otherwise. Part 6. A continuation on the property issue. Property relates to education in explicit and implicit ways. Recurring discussions about property tax relief indicate that more affluent communities, which have higher property values, hence higher tax assessments, resent paying for a public school system whose clientele is largely non-white and poor. They're literally just conflating black people with being poor. In the simplest equations, those with better property are entitled to better schools. Kozel illustrates the disparities. Average expenditures per pupil in the city of New York in 1987 were some $5,500. In the highest spending suburbs of New York, Great Neck or Manhasset, for example, on Long Island, funding levels rose above $11,000, with the highest districts in the state at $15,000. But the property differences manifest themselves in other ways. For example, curriculum represents a form of intellectual property. The quality and quantity of the curriculum varies with the property values of the school. The use of a critical race theory appropriately represents this notion. Only if you stretch to kind of sort of see each piece in that kind of way, with the assumption that you're looking through a race hyper-focused lens purposefully. The teenage son of one of the authors of this article was preparing to attend high school. A friend had a youngster of a similar age who was also preparing to enter high school. The boys excitedly pored over course offerings in their respective schools' catalogs. One boy was planning on attending school in an upper-middle-class white community. The other would be attending school in an urban, largely African district. The boy attending the white middle-class school had his choice of foreign languages: Spanish, French, German, Latin, Greek, Italian, Chinese, and Japanese. His mathematics offerings included algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, statistics, general math, and business math. The science department of this school offered biology, chemistry, physics, geology, science and society, biochemistry, and general science. The other boy's curriculum choices were not nearly as broad. His foreign language choices were Spanish and French. His mathematics choices were general math, business math, and algebra. There were no geometry or trig classes offered. His science choices were general science, life science, biology, and physical science. Differences in electives were even more pronounced, with the affluent school offering courses such as film as literature, Asian studies, computer programming, and journalism. Very few elective courses were offered at the African American school, which had no band, orchestra, or school newspaper. So it's definitely race then. The availability of rich or enriched intellectual property delimits what is now called opportunity to learn, the presumption that, along with providing educational standards that detail what students should know and be able to do, they must have the material resources that support their learning. Thus, intellectual property must be undergirded by real property, that is, science labs, computers, and other state-of-the-art technologies, appropriately certified and prepared teachers. Of course, Kozel demonstrates that schools that serve poor students of color are unlikely to have access to these resources, and consequently, students will have little or no opportunity to learn despite the attempt to mandate educational standards. So since they conflate black with poor, and poorer schools tend to not have quite as many options, therefore your property is actively being kept from you and are actively being suppressed and marginalized. And so conflating property with education and not giving as withholding. Good Lord, this Marxist shit. And again, this is what critical race theory is. Part 7, Critical Race Theory and Education. With this notion of property rights as a defining feature of the society, we proceed to describe the ways that the features of critical race theory mentioned in the previous section can be applied to our understanding of educational inequity. Remember how I said they just sort of assert something as true and then carry on without actually proving it? This is what I'm talking about. With this notion, so assuming this is true, we're going to proceed and then that's it. Just act like we're right. Racism as epidemic and deeply ingrained in American life. If racism were merely isolated, unrelated individual acts, we would expect to see at least a few examples of educational excellence and equity together in the nation's public schools. Instead, those places where African Americans do excellence, educational success tend to be outside of the public school. They just conflated public schools with poverty and black people. While some argue that poor children, regardless of race, do worse in school, and that the high proportion of African American poor contributes to their dismal school performance, we argue that the cause of their poverty, in conjunction with the condition of their schools and schooling, is institutional and structural racism. Because trust me, bro. Thus, when we speak of racism, we refer to Wellman's definition of culturally sanctioned beliefs which, regardless of the intentions involved, defend the advantages whites have because of the subordinated positions of racial minorities. We must therefore contend with the problem facing white people of coming to grips with the demands made by blacks and whites, while at the same time avoiding the possibility of institutional change and reorganization that might affect them. Christ, this is some of the most racist shit I've ever fucking read. And again, these are from supposedly the non-racist people fighting white supremacy and all that. They're literally telling on themselves with how racist they actually are, and just projecting it onto everyone else. Oh, well, we believe this, so they must believe this. It's not, we don't even just believe it. It's how the reality of the world actually is. Critical race theory, everybody. Part 8, a reinterpretation of ineffective civil rights laws. In the case of education, the civil rights decision that best exemplifies our position is the landmark Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. While having the utmost respect for the work of Thurgood Marshall and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP legal defense team, in arguing the Brown decision, with 40 years of hindsight, we recognize some serious shortcomings in that strategy. Today, students of color are more segregated than ever before. Although African Americans represent 12% of the national population, they are the majority in 21 of the 22 largest urban school districts. Instead of providing more and better educational opportunities, school desegregation has meant increased white flight, along with a loss of African American teaching and administrative positions. In explaining the double-edged sword of civil rights legislation, Crenshaw argued that the civil rights community must come to terms with the fact that anti-discrimination discourse is fundamentally ambiguous and can accommodate conservative as well as liberal views of race and equality. The dilemma suggests that the civil rights constituency cannot afford to view anti-discrimination doctrine as a permanent pronouncement of society's commitment to ending racial subordination. Rather, anti-discrimination law represents an ongoing ideological struggle in which occasional winners harness the moral, coercive, consensual power of law. Nonetheless, the victories it offers can be ephemeral and the risks of engagement substantial. An example of Crenshaw's point about the ambiguity of civil rights legislation was demonstrated in a high school district in Northern California. Of the 5 high schools in the district, one was located in a predominantly African American community. To entice white students to attend the school, the district funded a number of inducements, including free camping and ski trips. While the trips were available to all of the students, they were attended largely by the white students, who already owned the expensive camping and skiing equipment. However, these inducements were not enough to continuously attract white students. As enrollment began to fall, the district decided to close a school. Not surprisingly, the school in the African American community was closed, and all of its students had to be, and continued to be, bused to the 4 white schools in the district. Lamontie and Staley's examination of Buffalo's model desegregation program revealed that African American and Latino students continued to be poorly served by the school system. The academic achievement of African American and Latino students failed to improve while their suspension, expulsion, and dropout rates continued to rise. On the other hand, the desegregation plan provided special magnet programs and extended daycare of which whites were able to take advantage. What then made Buffalo a model school desegregation program? In short, the benefits that whites derived from school desegregation and their seeming support of the district's desegregation program. Thus, a model desegregation program becomes defined as one that ensures that whites are happy and do not leave the system altogether, regardless of whether African American and other students of color achieve or remain. In the business, we call these fallacies non sequiturs, false equivalence, and projection of intent, among many others. Good fucking God. And this is supposed to be critical race theory in schools. Part 9. Challenging claims of neutrality, objectivity, color-blindness, and meritocracy. A theme of naming one's own reality, or voice, is entrenched in the work of critical race theorists. So that's what they mean by voice. Many critical race theorists argue that the form and substance of scholarship are closely connected. These scholars use parables, chronicles, stories, counter-stories, poetry, fiction, and revisionist histories to illustrate the false necessity and irony of much of current civil rights doctrine. Delgado suggests there are at least 3 reasons for naming one's own reality in legal discourse. 1. Much of reality is socially constructed. 2. Stories provide members of outgroups a vehicle for psychic self-preservation. And 3. The exchange of stories from teller to listener can help overcome ethnocentrism and the disconscious conviction of viewing the world in one way. The first reason for naming one's own reality is to demonstrate how political and moral analysis is conducted in legal scholarship. Many mainstream legal scholars embrace universalism over particularity. According to Williams, theoretical legal understanding is characterized in Anglo-American jurisprudence by the acceptance of transcendent, acontextual, universal legal truths or procedures. For instance, some legal scholars might contend that the tort of fraud has always existed and that it is a component belonging to the universal system of right and wrong. What? This view tends to discount anything that is non-transcendent, historical, or contextual, socially constructed, or non-universal, specific, with the unscholarly labels of emotional, literary, personal, or false. They think that law and objectivity are just another religion. They're telling on themselves by projecting their own position. This is fucking insane. In contrast, critical race theorists argue that political and moral analysis is situational. Does that mean there's gray area and nuance? No, because truths only exist for this person in this predicament at this time in history. For the critical race theorist, social reality is constructed by the formulation and the exchange of stories about individual situations. These stories serve as interpretive structures by which we impose order on experience and it on us. You know, the stories they'd mentioned, like fiction and historical revisionism? A second reason for the naming one's own reality theme of critical race theory is the psychic preservation of marginalized groups. A factor contributing to the demoralization of marginalized groups is self-condemnation. The members of minority groups internalize the stereotypic images that certain elements of society have constructed in order to maintain their power. Historically, storytelling has been a kind of medicine to heal the wounds of pain caused by racial oppression. The story of one's condition leads to the realization of how one came to be oppressed and subjugated and allows one to stop inflicting mental violence on oneself. Finally, naming one's own reality with stories can affect the oppressor. Most oppression does not seem like oppression to the perpetrator. Delgado argues that the dominant group justifies its power with stories, stock explanations, that construct reality in ways to maintain their privilege. Thus, oppression is rationalized, causing little self-examination by the oppressor. Stories by people of color can catalyze the necessary cognitive conflict to jar disconscious racism. The voice component of critical race theory provides a way to communicate the experience and realities of the oppressed, a first step on the road to justice. As we attempt to make linkages between critical race theory and education, we contend that the voice of people of color is required for a complete analysis of the educational system. Delpit argues that one of the tragedies of education is the way in which the dialogue of people of color have been silenced. An example from her conversation with an African-American graduate student illustrates this point. There comes a moment in every class when we have to discuss the black issue and what's appropriate education for black children. I tell you, I'm tired of arguing with those white people because they won't listen. Well, I don't know if they really don't listen or if they just don't believe you. It seems like if you can't quote Vygotsky or something, then you don't have any validity to speak about your own kids. Anyway, I'm not bothering with it anymore. I'm just in it for a grade. A growing number of education scholars of color are raising critical questions about the way research is being conducted in communities of color. Thus, without authentic voices of people of color, as teachers, parents, educators, students, and community members, it is doubtful that we can say or know anything useful about education in their communities. It's a storytelling cult. In the same way DQSH is a fucking theater cult, they're saying that storytelling by certain people create reality. Not our perception, but like actively create reality. This is critical race theory. This is fucking insane. Part 10. The intersection of race and property. In the previous sections of this article, we argued that race is still a significant factor in determining inequity in the United States, and that the society is based on property rights rather than on human right. Yeah, but you didn't really do a good job at it, but okay. In this section, we discuss the intersection of race and property as a central construct in understanding a critical race theoretical approach to education. Harris argued that slavery linked the privilege of whites to the subordination of blacks through the legal regime that attempted the conversion of blacks into objects of property. That's not quite the same thing as treating someone as property. Similarly, the settlement and seizure of Native American land supported white privilege through a system of property rights in land in which the race of Native Americans rendered their first possession right invisible and justified conquest. I'm pretty sure it's not that convoluted. They just sort of wanted the land and took it. But more pernicious and long-lasting than the victimization of people of color is the construction of whiteness as the ultimate property. Possession, the act necessary to lay the basis for rights in property, was defined to include only the cultural practices of whites. This definition laid the foundation for the idea that whiteness, that which whites alone possess, is valuable and is property. So that's what they mean by whiteness. I'm sure they won't be limited on space and they'll be able to explain further. Because of space constraints, it is not possible to fully explicate Harris's thorough analysis of whiteness as property. Oh, so just trust us then. However, it is important to delineate what she terms the property functions of whiteness, which include rights of disposition, rights to use and enjoyment, reputation and status property, and the absolute right to exclude. How these rights apply to education is germane to our discussion. Rights of disposition. Because property rights are described as fully alienable, that is, transferable, it is difficult to see how whiteness can be construed as property. However, alienability of certain property is limited, e.g. entitlements, government licenses, professional degrees, or licenses held by one party and financed by the labor of the other in the context of divorce. Thus, whiteness, when conferred on certain student performances, is alienable. When students are rewarded only for conformity to perceived white norms or sanctioned for cultural practices, e.g. dress, speech pattern, unauthorized conceptions of knowledge, white property is being rendered alienable. Right to use and enjoyment. Legally, whites can use and enjoy the privileges of whiteness. As McIntosh has explicitly demonstrated, whiteness allows for specific social, cultural, and economic privileges. Fuller further asserts that whiteness is both performative and pleasurable. Oh god, that sounds familiar. In the school setting, whiteness allows for extensive use of school property. Kozol's description of the material differences in two New York City schools can be interpreted as the difference between those who possess the right to use and enjoy what schools can offer and those who do not. The white school serves 825 children in the kindergarten through 6th grade. This is approximately half the student population crowded into Black PS 79, where 1,550 children fill a space intended for 1,000, and a great deal smaller than the 1,300 children packed into the former skating rink. This right of use and enjoyment is also reflected in the structure of the curriculum, also described by Kozol. The curriculum the white school follows emphasizes critical thinking, reasoning, and logic. Planetarium, for instance, is employed not only for the study of the universe as it exists, students also are designated their own galaxies, the teacher says. In my Kozol's notes, 6 girls, 4 boys, 9 white, 1 Chinese. I'm glad they have this class, but what about the others? Aren't there 10 black children in the school who could enjoy this also? Reputation and status property. The concept of reputation as property is regularly demonstrated in legal cases of libel and slander. Except it's not. Thus, to damage someone's reputation is to damage some aspect of his or her personal property, if you'll want to look at it that way. In the case of race, to call a white person black is to defame him or her. In the case of schooling, to identify a school or program as non-white in any way is to diminish its reputation or status. Sounds like projection again. For example, despite the prestige of foreign language learning, bilingual education as practiced in the United States as a non-white form of second language learning has lower status. The term urban, the root word of urbane, has come to mean black. The term urban, the root word of urbane, has come to mean black. Thus, urban schools located in the urbane, sophisticated cities lack the status and reputation of suburban, white schools, and when urban students move to or bust to suburban schools, those schools lose their reputation. Or maybe you just see it as meaning black. It's critical race theory, everybody. Yeah. Part 11. A continuation. The absolute right to exclude. Whiteness is constructed in this society as the absence of the contaminating influences of blackness. Thus, one drop of black blood constructs one as black, regardless of phenotypic markers. In schooling, the absolute right to exclude was demonstrated initially by denying blacks access to school altogether. Later, it was demonstrated by the creation and maintenance of separate schools. More recently, it has been demonstrated by white flight and the growing insistence on vouchers, public funding of private schools, and schools of choice. Within schools, absolute right to exclude is demonstrated by resegregation via tracking, the institution of gifted programs, honors programs, and advanced placement classes. Wow, that's racist. So complete is this exclusion that black students often come to the university in the role of intruders who have been granted special permissions to be there. In this section, we have attempted to draw parallels between the critical race legal theory notion of whiteness as property and educational inequity. Yeah, you sure attempted it. In the final section, we relate some of the intellectual, theoretical tensions that exist between critical race theory and multicultural education. So that's what they mean by whiteness and property. It's not this glass is my property, it is that it has properties and it is like things, because things that you are like are things that you own, and your education is a thing that you own and have. It's literally just kind of sort of how they feel about it, not even about what's real or not. Critical race theory, everybody. Part 12. The limits of the multicultural paradigm. Throughout this article, we have argued the need for a critical race theoretical perspective to cast a new gaze on the persistent problems of racism in schooling. Well, at least they admit it. They're not trying to describe something happening. They're arguing that they want that lens. We've argued the need for this perspective because of the failure of scholars to theorize race. We need to do this because no one has done this. We have drawn parallels between the way critical race legal scholars understand their position vis-a-vis traditional legal scholarship and the ways critical race theory applied to education offers a way to rethink traditional educational scholarship. I mean, you can draw whatever parallels you want, but it doesn't make it so. We have also referred to the tensions that exist between traditional civil rights legislation and critical race legal theory. They don't go together, so we need to make them go together. In this section, we identify a necessary tension between critical race theory in education and what we term the multicultural paradigm. Multicultural education has been conceptualized as a reform movement designed to effect change in the school and other educational institutions so that students from diverse racial, ethnic, and other social class groups will experience educational equality. In most recent years, multicultural education has expanded to include issues of gender, ability, and sexual orientation. Although one could argue for an early history of multicultural education movement, as far back as the 1880s, when George Washington Williams wrote his History of African Americans, much of the current multicultural education practice seems more appropriately rooted in the intergroup education movement of the 1950s, which was designed to help African Americans and other unmeltable ethnics become a part of America's melting pot. Their goals were primarily assimilationist through the reduction of prejudice. However, after the civil rights unrest and growing self-awareness of African Americans in the 1960s, the desire to assimilate was supplanted by the reclamation of an authentic Black personality that did not rely on the acceptance by or standards of white America. This new vision was evidenced in the Academy in the form of first Black studies and then later, when other groups made similar liberating moves, ethnic studies. Current practical demonstrations of multicultural education in schools often reduce it to trivial examples and artifacts of culture such as eating ethnic or cultural foods, singing songs or dancing, reading folk tales, and other less than scholarly pursuits of the fundamentally different conceptions of knowledge or quests for social justice. At the university level, much of the concern over multicultural education has been over curriculum inclusion. However, on another level of debate emerged over what became known as multiculturalism. Somewhat different from multicultural education in that it does not represent a particular educational reform or scholarly tradition. Multiculturalism came to be viewed as a political philosophy of many cultures existing together in an atmosphere of respect and tolerance. Thus, outside of the classroom, multiculturalism represented the attempt to bring both students and faculty from a variety of cultures into the school or academy environment. Today, the term is used interchangeably with the ever-expanding diversity, a term used to explain all types of difference: racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, ability, gender, sexual orientation. Thus, popular music, clothes, media, books, and so forth reflect a growing awareness of diversity and/or multiculturalism. Less often discussed are the growing tensions that exist between and among various groups that gather under the umbrella of multiculturalism. That is, interests of groups can be competing or the perspectives can be at odds. We assert that the ever-expanding multicultural paradigm follows the traditions of liberalism, allowing a proliferation of difference. Unfortunately, the tensions between and among these differences is rarely interrogated, presuming a unity of difference, that is, that all difference is both analogous and equivalent. They're saying that being able to set aside differences is a bad thing. And they're saying that because the outcomes aren't the same all the way across the board, that we need to interrogate and inflame and hyper-focus on the differences of their choice being race because they chose to do that, because the other Marxists only did it with class and gender and sex and not this yet. And we're just about done, but it keeps getting worse in critical race theory. And finally, part 13, a continuation. To make parallel the analogy between critical race legal theory and traditional civil rights law with that of critical race theory in education and multicultural education, we need to restate the point that critical race legal theorists have doubts about the foundation of moderate and incremental civil rights law. The foundation of civil rights law has been in human rights rather than in property rights. Thus, without disrespect to the pioneers of civil rights law, critical race legal scholars document the ways in which civil rights law is regularly subverted to benefit whites. We argue that the current multicultural paradigm functions in a manner similar to civil rights law. Instead of creating radically new paradigms that ensure justice, multicultural reforms are routinely sucked back into the system. And just as traditional civil rights law is based on a foundation of human rights, the current multicultural paradigm is mired in liberal ideology that offers no radical change in the current order. Thus, critical race theory in education, like its antecedents in legal scholarship, is a radical critique of both the status quo and the purported reforms. Choose to pick apart something entirely and blame every single unequal outcome on race, so that you can then throw it out and make a new one. We make this observation of the limits of the current multicultural paradigm not to disparage the scholarly efforts and sacrifices of many of its proponents, but to underscore the difficulty, indeed impossibility, of maintaining the spirit and intent of justice for the oppressed, while simultaneously permitting the hegemonic rule of the oppressor. Thus, as critical race theory scholars, we unabashedly reject a paradigm that attempts to be everything to everyone and consequently becomes nothing to anyone, allowing the status quo to prevail. Instead, we align our scholarship and activism with the philosophy of Marcus Garvey, who believed that the black man was universally oppressed on racial grounds, and that any program of emancipation would have to be built around the question of race first. In his own words, Garvey speaks to us clearly and unequivocally. In a world of wolves, one should go armed. And one of the most powerful defense weapons within the reach of Negroes is the practice of race first in all parts of the world. That's how it ends the fucking paper. That's critical race theory. Not critically thinking about... No! That's critical race theory. This is abhorrent. This is horrifically racist. This is teaching and implementing racism and racialization back into the schools. This is fucking disgusting. When we're talking about getting critical race theory out of education, this is what we're talking about. They spell it out for you. It's not some big mystery. Toward a critical race theory of education. God, what a miserable fucking paper.